He thought she was just another woman looking for rich husbands in first class, until he found out who she really was. The first-class cabin smelled of expensive leather and money. Soft conversations hummed through the air, blending with the occasional clink of a champagne glass. Overhead compartments clicked shut as passengers settled in, adjusting designer bags and expensive watches, each one radiating wealth and status. Joe William Carter barely looked up from his phone as he slid into seat 3A, a window seat just the way he liked it. He was a man used to luxury, a man who belonged in first class. Everything about him, the tailored suit, the polished shoes, the confident air, said he was someone important, someone who made deals and closed them with ease. He was the kind of man who had spent years in boardrooms where people laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. Before takeoff, he loosened his tie slightly, not because he needed to, but because it sent a message. He wasn't just another businessman on a flight, he was the kind of man who could afford to fly first class whenever he wanted. He flagged down the flight attendant and ordered a scotch, settling in to enjoy the 3-hour flight from Dallas to Tampa. It wasn't a long journey, but it was long enough for him to enjoy the perks of luxury travel. He had no intention of working. This flight was for relaxing, sipping on premium drinks and maybe people watching. That's when he noticed her. A blonde woman, seated a few rows ahead, was scrolling through her iPad, her profile partially visible. Something about her seemed familiar, but not enough for him to immediately place. Maybe she was a local news anchor or a former actress, someone who had once been in the spotlight but had since faded into the background. A woman past her prime, clinging to the last remnants of whatever made her important. William smirked and nudged the man sitting beside him, a quiet, mild-mannered traveler who clearly had no interest in conversation but was unlucky enough to be seated next to someone who did. Ever notice how some people think money can buy class? William said, making sure his voice was just loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. The man beside him gave a polite, non-committal chuckle and kept his eyes on the in-flight magazine, hoping William would take the hint. You didn't? She looks familiar, William continued, tilting his head slightly. Probably some reality TV reject. You know the type, big hair, expensive handbag, and no idea how to blend in. His words floated into the air, reaching the ears of those around him. A few passengers glanced his way, but the blonde woman remained completely focused on her iPad, showing no sign that she had heard him. That didn't sit well with William. People like her were supposed to care about what men like him thought. They were supposed to react, to engage. The fact that she didn't make him double down. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and the flight attendants made their final rounds, checking seat belts and collecting empty glasses. William leaned back in his seat, already growing bored of the flight before it had even truly begun. He watched as the blonde woman politely handed off her drink and smiled at the attendant. Her posture was composed, her demeanor calm. It irritated him. There was a quiet confidence about her, an ease that suggested she wasn't the type to be rattled by side comments or sideways glances. And that made William even more determined to get a reaction. She must have married well, he mused, shaking his head as if he found the entire thing amusing. That's usually how these stories go. Third husband, maybe fourth. Plastic surgeons on speed dial. It's always the same. This time there was a noticeable shift in the air. The businessman across the aisle cast a brief but pointed glance in his direction. The flight attendant hesitated ever so slightly as she moved past. Even the man sitting next to him exhaled quietly, as if silently begging for the flight to be over already. William, of course, didn't notice. Or maybe he just didn't care. The plane lifted off and he took another sip of his scotch, tapping his fingers against the glass. 3 hours, plenty of time to entertain himself. But what he didn't realize was that his entertainment was about to come at his own expense. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when William resumed his one-sided conversation. He wasn't the kind of man who let things go, especially not when he felt ignored. The woman, whoever she was, had barely acknowledged his existence, hadn't even spared him a glance. That didn't sit right with him. So he leaned in, determined to make himself heard. The moment the seatbelt sign blinked off, he waved down the flight attendant with an exaggerated motion, as if he were at a bar rather than on a plane. Another scotch, he said, handing over his empty glass. Then, just to be that guy, he nodded toward the blonde woman. And whatever she's having too. On me. It was a test, a way to force a reaction. Maybe she'd laugh, shake her head, engage in a bit of playful banter. Women like her loved attention. At least that's what he assumed. But the flight attendant didn't even blink. She's fine, sir, she said smoothly, taking his glass and moving away before he could press further. William chuckled to himself, shaking his head. "Oh, so she's one of those?" he muttered. "The kind of woman who acted like she was better than everyone else, who pretended to be too important for small talk." He turned back to his reluctant seatmate, who had now opened a book in a clear attempt to avoid any further conversation. "Have you ever noticed that?" William said, tapping the armrest between them. "How do some people walk around like they're the main character in life? Like the rest of us are just extras in their little movie?" The man gave him a quick glance before returning to his book. "Haven't really thought about it," he said flatly. William grinned, undeterred. "I'll tell you exactly who she is," he continued, keeping his voice at that perfect volume, not loud enough to be accused of being rude, but just enough to ensure those nearby could hear. "She's the kind of woman who gets by on her last name. On favors. Some senator's ex-wife, maybe. Or one of those lawyers who loves the camera but couldn't win a case to save her life." He let the words linger, waiting for something, anything. A reaction, a shift in posture, a flicker of irritation. Anything to let him know he was getting under her skin. Nothing. The blonde woman remained composed, scrolling through her tablet as if he were nothing more than background noise. As if he weren't even worth acknowledging. William exhaled sharply through his nose, adjusting his watch in irritation. This wasn't fun anymore. "Not even a glance," he muttered to himself. "Guess she's too important for the rest of us." A few rows back, a woman in a dark blue pants suit shared a look with the person sitting next to her across the aisle. An older man looked up from his newspaper, raising one eyebrow. People were noticing him now. But William, thinking he was very smart, believed they were on his side. He thought they also found the woman silly just like he did. That made him even more confident. He leaned forward, resting his elbow on the armrest. He lowered his voice a little, as if he was sharing a big secret. "Just wait and see," he said with a smirk. "She's going to post something later about how tiring travel is. Probably complain about men taking up too much space or something silly. Women like her love to act like victims. But I bet." "Excuse me, sir." The voice was calm but firm. William turned his head, expecting to see the flight attendant again. But no, it was her. The blonde woman had turned to face him for the first time. Her face was hard to read. She wasn't angry. She wasn't annoyed. She just looked at him. A quiet, steady look. William suddenly realized how loud he had been speaking. For the first time in a long time he felt something strange. Something uncomfortable. But he shook it off. He stared back, waiting for her to get mad or argue with him. But she didn't. She just looked at him for a moment, then gave the smallest, unreadable smile. Then she turned back to her tablet like he wasn't worth her time. And for the first time, William felt something he wasn't used to feeling. William shifted in his seat, fixing his cufflink as if that could make him feel better. That look she had given him, it wasn't annoying. It wasn't dismissive. It was worse. It was knowing. Like she had seen men like him before. 100 times. And she had already decided he wasn't worth talking to. That should have made it easy for him to brush off. To roll his eyes and go back to drinking his scotch. But it didn't. Instead, it bothered him. The flight attendant returned with his drink, setting it down with a polite nod before walking away. He noticed she didn't stop to chat. No small talk. No friendly smile. Had she heard him too? William took a slow sip. The ice clinked in the glass. He glanced at the woman again. Pam, he reminded himself. He still didn't know exactly who she was, but something about her name felt familiar. She was still reading. Still calm. But now that she had acknowledged him once, something had changed. A silent challenge. William didn't like challenges. So this time he spoke to her directly. He kept his voice low but loud enough for others nearby to hear little bits. "Pam, is it? You don't look like Pam." She didn't answer. William felt a small twist in his stomach. But he kept going. "I mean, no offense," he added, chuckling. "It's just, I don't know. You look more like a Kelly or a Lauren." He shook his head. "Pam sounds like someone's mom." Still nothing. William shifted in his seat. She wasn't just ignoring him. She was letting him embarrass himself. Across the aisle, the older man had gone back to his newspaper. But William had seen the way he had looked at him before. A few rows ahead, a younger man in a business suit was pretending to type on his laptop. But William knew the trick. The man was listening. Even the flight attendant, who had just walked by, was watching him from the corner of her eye. William's stomach felt tight. They weren't laughing with him. He exhaled sharply through his nose and sat back in his seat. Fine. Let them judge. People were too sensitive these days. Acting like a little joke was some big insult. He hadn't said anything that bad. He finished the last sip of his scotch and set the glass down a little too hard. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for the perfect moment, the flight attendant spoke. "Miss Bondi, would you like another drink?" William barely heard the words at first. It wasn't until the blonde woman, Pam, looked up and politely said no that his brain caught up. Bondi. Pam Bondi. William's whole body went stiff. His fingers curled on the armrest. Now it made sense. Former Attorney General of Florida. Famous, powerful, connected. A tough lawyer who had fought against big corporations, faced off with politicians and won. And now he remembered where he had seen her before. On TV. In courtrooms. At press conferences. William felt sick. Pam Bondi wasn't just familiar. She was the kind of person who could destroy someone's life with a single phone call. William's throat went dry. He glanced at her again. But she wasn't looking at him. She didn't need to. She already knew. And now so did he. For the first time during the flight, William had nothing to say. His mind raced, searching for a way out. Pam Bondi. Her name echoed in his head, making him feel smaller and smaller. His fingers tightened around the armrest. How had he not recognized her sooner? Of course he had seen her before. She had been everywhere. On every news channel. Fighting battles. Winning. And now he was sitting just a few feet away from her, realizing that all the rude comments he had made had landed in the worst possible place. William's face felt hot. He glanced around the plane. The older man across the aisle. The businessman pretending to type. The flight attendant. They had all heard him. Had he really just made fun of a former attorney general in front of an entire first-class cabin? William cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. He had to fix this. He turned slightly toward her and forced a smile. I thought you looked familiar, he said with a nervous laugh. Didn't realize I was sitting next to Florida royalty. Pam didn't react. She didn't turn. She didn't speak. She just kept reading her tablet. Like he wasn't even there. William's stomach twisted. She had heard every word. She understood every joke. And she had decided. He wasn't worth responding to. That was worse than if she had gotten mad. Much worse. If she had argued with him, at least he could have said something back. Made a joke. Laughed it off. But this was on purpose. She had chosen to let him sit there, stewing in his own embarrassment. William moved in his seat again, pretending to fix his seatbelt. He was trying so hard to think of something, anything, to say that would make things better. "I actually followed some of your cases a long time ago," he said, trying to sound friendly. "You've had an amazing career." But she didn't say anything. She didn't even look at him. William felt his skin prickle. He let out a breath and rubbed his jaw. Suddenly he felt very aware of how long this flight was. It was bad enough to feel embarrassed for a few minutes, but now he was stuck in a plane 35,000 feet in the air, with no way to escape the awkward silence he had caused. And just when he thought it couldn't get worse, the flight attendant came back. "Another drink, sir?" she asked. William opened his mouth to say yes, but then he stopped. He wasn't sure why, but suddenly, another glass of scotch didn't seem like a good idea. "Just water," he mumbled. The flight attendant nodded and took his empty glass. That's when he noticed it, a tiny flicker of amusement in Pam Bondi's eyes. She didn't turn her head. She didn't say a word. But in that tiny moment, William knew she had been watching him. She had been waiting. And now, she was enjoying his discomfort. For the first time in a long time, Joe William Carter knew what it felt like to be small. He sat stiffly in his seat, his own words pressing down on him like a heavy weight. How did he let this happen? He was usually good at reading people, good at controlling conversations. He always made sure he never looked like the fool. But now he was stuck, staring at the back of a woman's head, someone who had made him feel so small without even speaking. His mind raced. Should he apologize? Make a joke? Pretend none of this had happened? He looked at the other passengers. The businessman across the aisle wasn't looking at him anymore, but William caught the small smirk on his lips. He had definitely been watching earlier. The flight attendant was more professional. She simply gave William a neutral look as she set down his water. William cleared his throat. And that somehow felt worse. Because she didn't pity him. She didn't care. He wasn't important enough to care about. William's eyes moved back to Pam Bondi. She was still reading. Still unbothered. Still acting like none of this mattered. And maybe that's what hurt the most. She wasn't mad. She wasn't waiting for an apology. She had already decided he wasn't worth thinking about. William hated that feeling. And it was his own fault. His fingers tapped on the tray table. He felt restless. Frustrated. He thought about the stories he had read about her, the big cases, the people who had tried to scare her and failed. And yet, he had thought she would care about what he had to say. William let out a slow breath. Maybe it was the altitude. Maybe it was because he had nowhere to go. But for the first time in a long time, he started thinking about the kind of person he had become. For years, he had walked into rooms like he owned them. He talked like his words were the most important. He believed his version of the truth was the only one that mattered. But right now, he wasn't the powerful one. Right now, he has no control. And he didn't like that feeling. The plane hummed softly. People around him talked quietly. Glasses clinked. William picked up his water and took a sip, staring at the seat in front of him. Maybe people like him didn't learn lessons until they had no choice. Maybe this was exactly what he deserved. William looked out the window. The sky stretched out beyond the wing, going on forever. It made him feel small. It was a strange feeling. He wasn't sure he liked it. For years, he had acted like the center of the world. People laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. People nodded along when he spoke, even when he had nothing important to say. He was used to people paying attention to him. But today he was reminded of something he had forgotten. Respect isn't about money. It isn't about power. It isn't about being the loudest person in the room. It's about character. Pam Bondi hadn't tried to make him feel small. She didn't have to. His own arrogance did that for her. William took another sip of water. It wasn't scotch, but maybe that was a good thing. For once, he needed to sit with his thoughts, not drown them in alcohol. He glanced at Pam Bondi again, half expecting her to finally look at him, to give him a look of satisfaction. But she didn't. She was done with him. She had been done with him the moment she realized what kind of man he was. That thought twisted in his chest. It wasn't often that someone like him had to face themselves, had to sit in the uncomfortable truth that they had been the fool in the room. William sighed, rubbing his temple. Maybe it was time he started listening more, talking less. Maybe it was time he stopped assuming he knew everything. The flight attendant passed by again. And for the first time, William didn't wave her down for another drink. Instead, he sat quietly, watching the sky. As the plane began its descent into Tampa, he realized something. This wasn't about Pam Bondi. This was about the kind of man he wanted to be. How often do we judge people before we know them? How many times does arrogance stop us from seeing the truth? Maybe the real lesson isn't about power or status. Maybe it's about learning to treat people with respect before it's too late. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more exciting stories filled with adventure, mystery, and unforgettable moments. Your support means the world. It keeps these stories coming and the creativity flowing. Thanks for watching, and I can't wait to see you in the next video.